Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about classes. Let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, having classes in a React/Redux code base is considered an anti-pattern, correct? Well, no. And like for me, this and the best part is that the follow-up is a comment saying that Redux is an anti-pattern in of itself. Okay, so let's back this up a little bit. Uh, I will go out on a limb here and say that, and I'm gonna guess that you have basically you have very little knowledge of any type of programming. I think the person who is commenting again might have slightly more, or at the very least, but I would question their experience levels as well, because like your question, it doesn't make sense to me at all. Because like, why would a class be an anti-pattern just for the sake of what? Because it's a class. So you're using React and Redux, and then using a class is an anti-pattern. So my question is to you: why would it be an anti-pattern? What consequences do you get from using one? So this is for me one of those examples where a person has been told a rule that they don't actually understand, like why it's a rule. They have no like. I have these conversations with quite a lot of people, not just in programming, where like they make claims that they don't like. They hold them up as facts, and then I just ask them to clarify a little bit, and the whole thing just comes down to, I was told this thing and it made sense to me, or it emotionally made sense to me. It's the same thing I say to people when they say, "Oh, we need to be dry." Okay, you put everything in a constant, the code is absolute shit and nobody can understand it, but you're being dry, right? Oh, we need to be solid. Okay, this method here, how does it break the solid principles? And when you ask, they don't really know. They can't really ask like to me, like you're following a doctrine. So who has told you that classes in a React or Redux code base is an anti-pattern? Because I can think of a few cases where it might be a very decent thing to do. I'll give you a very concrete example. So a few years ago, I was working for a company that had a system which was a high integration system, as I like to refer to it. It was an aggregation system for about 13 or 14 various APIs. The whole front-end application was basically just a UI interface for all of these APIs that displayed information on a web page, like from various parts of the organization in question. And so what I did when we started was to pick up this team that had written the like this entire application basically and just integrated to a bunch of stuff, right? And so what they had done was that they had created a well, basically a gigantic ecosystem of various network calls for all of these different APIs, right? And this is a React Redux application. And most of it was being done through just using the fetch function, like with hard-coded URLs, and there was like a few sporadic attempts here and there to make like utility functions that did A or B or something like that, right? In order to make like to fetch all this data. And I think what most people felt at the time when I joined, that this was not working out all that well for them. So I thought to myself, okay, how can we clean this up a little bit? Because at least in my experience, one of the best things you can do when you're developing API, like when you're working with any type of third-party system or any API, is to create an API client for it. The reason being because, as you can probably imagine, when you have like 13 various APIs that are fetching data from various places throughout the whole application, right? That is a lot of duplication usually. And in some cases, in these cases especially, you had these common patterns where certain headers were needed for every network call and things like that. And so what we did was that I took all of these various, like basically copy-pasted fetch functions across the board. I identified which APIs they were connecting to see if I could group them a little bit, and so I found a few common patterns. So as I said, it was about 13 total, but the amount of fetch calls that were being done was in the, in like several dozens of duplications all across the board, right? I put all of these network calls, because some of them were going to the same API. It was just different methods or different paths on the same API. I put them in a class and put that class into a folder, which I named after the API integration. And then I put that folder into an API folder. So there was one API folder, and in that API folder was just a list of folders which were named based on the integration that we had. And then I took I created a little README file and put that in there, so that it just, with that README file, all it had was the name of the API, contact information to the people who were maintaining the API, and the various environments that we had at our disposal for testing and things like that. And of course a little bit of a link to like the API documentation if you needed to read up on it. Now, would you say that that is an anti-pattern? What about that was an anti-pattern? Because I actually have a second part of the story where a person actually made this and claimed that this was an anti-pattern. So what I basically did was that I used a class to encapsulate all the methods necessary in order to fetch data from a third-party system. It is in no way specific to React or Redux or anything like that, and I think that most people would be very familiar with that sort of setup if you come from any other language. Like if you work in, say, Java or C# or something like that, API clients is a pretty common thing. It's a very established pattern. So my guess is that if you think about it in React Redux, like you might be thinking about class components, that is an anti-pattern, and sure, to modern standards it is a bit of an anti-pattern today, because most of the community has gone over to like functional components or so forth, and hooks. But the idea behind a class is nothing more than an object with properties. Some of them might be, some of it might be methods, and some of it, like in JavaScript lands, of course, we don't need that. We can just use an object instead of a class. But like, I hope you understand, like, this was just a way for me to create an instance of a class that had the same configuration and so forth and so forth. Basically, just create an object that had a bunch of methods on it, so that I could connect with all of these various APIs without having to duplicate all that functionality all across the board. So after establishing that, people were using it, there were no issues, it was fairly clean, and it made the code a lot more testable, because I can tell you right now, if you have ever tried to debug or like to write tests for a React component and all of its network calls and things like that, you know the pain of having to mock and stub and like all of this sort of stuff in order to be able to do that for the component. When I did this, that became a cakewalk. It was super easy. We had tests for all of these API clients, which we did not have originally because of this exact problem. And when we were testing the components themselves, we could very easily stub and mock the method instead of, creating mocks for the modules and so forth and so forth. So there were some secondary benefits to this. And then the second part of my story happens. I need to leave the team for another project. And another software developer comes in and says, this is an anti-pattern. You're using a class. And object-oriented programming forces you to use more methods, like because of the problem where if you pass an object to something, you are using more, you're creating an abstraction where you bundle together all these methods. So if I only need one method, I need still to create an instance of the entire object so that I can get access to that method. So what he did was to create a bunch of functions instead in a module. Like he created, instead of having a class for this, he basically just created a file which had in JavaScript land just functions that did the same thing. And then he converted those into higher order functions so that he could do it this way, and I could do it this way. Now, was that an anti-pattern? Well, it's actually funny because I have on many occasions said that no, I don't think that to have functions instead of using classes when appropriate is actually, I think, a very good thing. It's just that the reason why I did it with classes was because it is a pattern that is more familiar to the average software developer. In other words, I can take any backend developer and put them in this code base, and they will understand how like an API client class basically works. They will know that immediately. The thing he did, I argue, it makes a lot of sense for the people like myself who have a bit of a functional background, who understand how, passing functions might be more, it might be more efficient in certain situations, and treating them as first-class citizens and things like that is a pretty nice pattern if you know how to use it. The problem he did not understand, which I argue I did, because then like a few weeks later some people came to me who were working with me at the time and said, yeah, it feels like weird now because I don't really understand how this works and stuff like that. That's the thing I had accounted for. I suspected that using higher order functions and so forth in order to do this thing, even though I find that to be a very nice pattern to work with, but then again I have spent a lot of time to try to understand functional principles, I thought that that would be a little bit too much for the comprehension to be in a good balance. But it's still not an anti-pattern. It really is just a trade-off. Okay, so you're trading this efficiency of using just functions instead of a whole object, and you're doing that in this case at the expense of having the juniors take a little bit longer to understand what's going on. So what I want you to take away from this is that no, using classes in a Redux or React codebase is not an anti-pattern, and Redux in of itself is not an anti-pattern. It comes down to how do you use it. You can turn anything into an anti-pattern if you really want to. I promise you that much. If you don't know how to correctly use it and how to, like as I like to say, it's like cooking. If you get a recipe and then take a fistful of salt and just throw it into the food, you can ruin any dish, basically, because you don't know how to apply it correctly. And that's why I tell you, before because you indicate with the way you formulate yourself as you don't really know how to use a class. You don't even know like what you're asking. You're saying that it's an anti-pattern. I go, why is it an anti-pattern? When you explain to me why you think it is an anti-pattern and what effects it has, then we can have an informed conversation about pros and cons and things like that, like I had in my little story, pros and cons. That's what the person who knows what an anti-pattern is or what a good practice actually is would say, or like how they would reason. And a person who just inherits someone else's opinion will just say it's an anti-pattern with no explanation. It's literally like just believing that something is true because someone told you so. So ask yourself, why? Why is it an anti-pattern? Or why is this a best practice? What are the benefits and consequences of this choice? Have a great day.